In a faded government photograph, a lone mass rises out of an open plain, like something cut rather than formed. Its sides are fluted, almost fibrous, dark grooves running straight down for hundreds of feet. The top is blunt, the base spreads into broken shelves and a ring of fallen stone. Snow sits around it in a white sheet, which only makes the object look larger, less natural, more deliberate. It resembles a mountain only because that is the word we have been told to use. Seen without a label, it looks closer to the severed remains of something that once stood far above the landscape around it. Not a hill, not a cliff, a stump. And once that image appears, it becomes difficult to remove. If this is only rock, why does it look so strangely familiar? The accepted explanation is straightforward. These formations, we are told, are the products of pressure, heat, uplift, cooling, and erosion operating across spans of time so large that the eye has no instinct for them. Some are described as volcanic necks, some as laccoliths, some as buttes, mesas, plugs, tors, towers, or erosional remnants. Their vertical lines are said to be cooling fractures. Their flat crowns are the remains of harder caprock. Their isolation is a result of softer surrounding material being stripped away by wind, water, frost, and gravity. The timeline is long, the processes are real, and in many cases the mineral record does support an igneous or sedimentary origin. That is the official explanation. It is coherent, it is taught, it is printed on signs. And yet there is a reason the image refuses to go away. Because what remains on the ground does not always feel fully answered by the language used to classify it. There are formations with cylindrical bodies, flared bases, flattened tops, concentric terraces, bark-like ridges, radial drainage, and surrounding debris that looks less like random collapse than like the break pattern of something once organized around a central axis. There are landscapes where these forms stand not as part of an obvious ridge or range, but as singular vertical remnants separated from the terrain around them like survivors of a vanished system. There are old photographs in which scale fails, and the eye reads trunk before it reads mountain. There are petrified forests, mineralized wood, silicified roots, and fossilized organic structures already known to science. The process of petrification is not the problem. The problem is scale, and scale is where the official account becomes most confident and most difficult to test by ordinary intuition. So the hidden theory is not that every geologist is lying or that every map is fake. It is more specific and more unsettling than that. It is that some formations classified as ancient rock structures may be the mineralized remains of colossal organic forms from a world whose biological range is no longer considered possible. Not all hills, not all cliffs, but a class of objects whose shape, fracture, placement, and context suggests that the category may have been chosen before the object was truly understood. That is a serious claim, and it deserves to be treated seriously. Not as a rant, not as folklore, as an investigative possibility, because once an object enters the record under one explanation, entire institutions begin to work around that explanation. Measurements are gathered inside it. Samples are read through it. The landscape does not change. What changed was the explanation. Start with form, not symbolism, not myth, form. A stump has certain physical habits. It narrows or swells in ways that respond to growth. It can flare at the base. It can preserve radial cracking as internal stress releases after cutting, drying, burning, or mineral replacement. It may show concentric banding where the outer mass resists weather differently from the inner core. Now look at the formations that provoke this theory. Many are vertically organized around a central mass. Many display long exterior striations. Many terminate in a top plane or broken crown. Many stand above surrounding material in a way that suggests extreme difference in hardness between the object and its environment. None of that proves biological origin, but resemblance by itself is not trivial, especially when it repeats across regions and across scales. Geology depends on morphology all the time. It classifies by shape, fracture, layering, grain, and relation to surrounding ground. If resemblance is strong enough to support one interpretation, it cannot be dismissed as meaningless when it supports another. Then there is measurement, and measurement is where the theory becomes harder to wave away with a smile. The vertical grooves on some towers are not random ripples. They are organized, repeated, and in certain cases remarkably parallel. The outer walls of some formations appear less like broken rubble than like bundled elements compressed into stone. The top surfaces of some mesas and monoliths are not peaked like ordinary remnants of collapse. They are abrupt, truncated, almost cut. The edges weather back in rings. The debris field often gathers in collars around the base. Even the surrounding slopes can look like the remains of outer tissue, stripped and slumped away from a denser center. Geology has explanations for all of this. It speaks of jointing, exfoliation, differential erosion, talus, bedding planes, resistant caprock. Those are real mechanisms. But the question is not whether those words exist. The question is whether they explain these objects better than they classify them. Classification is not the same as explanation. Sometimes it is only a pause. The old maps matter too. Early surveyors often described what they saw in plain physical language before the full technical vocabulary settled over the land. Tower, butte, monument, castle, dome, table, devil's tower, chimney rock, courthouse rock, watchman, sentinel. Names do not prove biology, but they reveal first contact with form. The eye saw structures, trunks, columns, pedestals, walls, and crowns long before it saw intrusive necks and erosional remnants. Later, as geological mapping matured, the same objects were absorbed into a system of categories built for rock. Again, that is not misconduct. It is how institutions work. They standardize, they narrow, they convert the strange into the legible. But when the same type of object receives a folk description that matches ordinary anatomy, then a technical description that matches process, something important happens. The object has not changed, only the governing language has. The record is still there. And in the record, what appears first is not always foolish. Sometimes it is simply unprocessed. Photographs deepen the problem because the camera is very good at recording contradiction. In late 19th century and early 20th century images, certain formations appear more abrupt than they do in modern tourism photography. Before roads, railings, parking lots, visitor centers, and interpretive signs, they sit in the frame as raw facts. Some look burnt, some look cut, some look fibrous. Some sit in planes like implants from another order of scale. Modern familiarity softens them. The eye has learned how to see them. We arrive already instructed. We call them natural wonders. We call them geologic monuments. We do not stand in front of them as first witnesses, but the photograph does. And a first witness does not always think mountain. A first witness sees something that seems less deposited than left behind, something not assembled from a landscape, but protruding from the disappearance of one. The stone remembers. What matters is that the camera often records the same unease the stump theory begins with, a sense that the object does not belong cleanly to the category assigned to it. There is also the matter of petrification itself. Fossil wood is not rare. Mineral replacement of organic tissue is established science. Entire forests have been preserved as stone down to cellular structure. Roots, bark, rings, and internal grains survive under the right conditions. Silica-rich water can infiltrate buried wood and slowly replace its organic material while preserving form. That is not fringe material. It is museum material. It is textbook material. So the argument is not asking whether wood can become stone. It can. The argument is asking whether the boundary of what counts as preserved wood has been drawn too narrowly because accepted biological scale has been drawn too narrowly. If a hand-sized branch can petrify, and a full trunk can petrify, and a forest can petrify, then the process does not vanish at larger dimensions. What vanishes is our willingness to entertain the dimensions. The chemistry does not forbid the idea. Our model of past life does. Those are not the same thing. A fair reading of the mainstream case is necessary here, because the mainstream case is not weak. Columnar jointing is real. Basalt and other igneous bodies do fracture into repeated polygonal columns as they cool. Lava can create formations that look manufactured, bundled, even architectural. Entire coastlines and canyon walls display these patterns. In many sites, the mineral content surrounding strata, contact effects, and regional volcanic history strongly support conventional geology. There is no need to invent a lost forest to explain every dramatic tower on Earth. That would be careless. But fairness cuts both ways. The mainstream explanation is powerful where chemical and structural evidence is direct. It is less satisfying where the explanation leans heavily on category and analogy, especially in objects whose overall morphology continues to evoke organic design more strongly than surrounding terrain would predict. The official explanation accounts for much. What it may fail to explain is why certain specific objects produce the same anatomical impression across viewers, eras, and continents. The pattern does not disappear, and the pattern widens as soon as one stops staring at a single monument and begins looking at distributions. Isolated flat-topped masses, cylindrical towers with vertical fluting, broad crowns over narrowed stems, radial drainage systems around central stone bodies, collars of debris encircling solitary uprights, platforms that look sheared, outer ridges that weather in bands. These forms appear in deserts, forests, high plains, plateaus, and canyon country. They appear under different labels and in different rock families, yet the visual grammar repeats. One case might be coincidence, 10 cases become style, 100 become a question. Why does the landscape produce so many remnants that resemble cut biological columns? Why do they often stand alone, as if their surroundings were removed from them rather than simply worn down around them? Geology answers with uplift and erosion, with resistant cores and stripped sediment. Sometimes that is enough. But when a pattern repeats at continental scale, explanation has to compete not only with chemistry, but with morphology, distribution, and recurrence. Surrounding infrastructure, or the lack of it, adds another layer. If many of these formations are simply remnants of larger rock masses, the surrounding terrain should more often preserve clearer evidence of that continuity, matching walls, transitional ridges, obvious parent bodies, predictable bedding, or a gradient of breakdown from structure to debris. Sometimes it does, often it does not. Instead, there is emptiness, plains, low relief, detached platforms, scarps that feel too small for the supposed scale of what vanished. The theory draws strength from absence, not because absence is proof, but because absence shapes interpretation. A colossal stump would also stand in emptiness if the surrounding organic or softer matrix were removed, burned, compressed, dissolved, or reworked into other strata. That possibility remains speculative, but it is not structurally absurd. In fact, it can fit the visual field as well as the accepted story in certain places, and when two different explanations can both occupy the same silhouette, the decisive question becomes evidence, not vocabulary. That is where legal and institutional definitions become unexpectedly important. Once land is catalogued as geologic, it enters one branch of management. Mining surveys, park descriptions, heritage designations, school materials, and conservation laws all inherit the same frame. The object is treated as bedrock, not remnant tissue. Sampling strategies follow suit. Interpretive signs reinforce the category. Tourism copies the sign. Educational media repeats the tourism. Over time, the explanation no longer feels like a conclusion. It feels like the object itself. And this is how strange ideas can remain untested without anyone needing to hide anything. A classification, once bureaucratically embedded, becomes expensive to challenge, not politically expensive, administratively expensive, epistemically expensive. It requires new questions, new sampling logic, new peer risk, new funding, new terms. Most anomalies do not die because someone suppresses them. They die because no department is assigned to them. The truth, if there is one here, may have been buried less by conspiracy than by paperwork, specialization, and the gravitational force of accepted categories. The historical timing is also difficult to ignore. Many of the modern labels for these formations stabilized during the same period that geology, paleontology, industrial mining, and land administration were being consolidated into national systems. This was a period obsessed with mapping, extraction, standardization, and scale. Anything outside an approved natural history had to be translated into one. That did not make the science fraudulent, it made it formative. Early frameworks often harden before their edge cases are understood. Coal basins became carbonized vegetation under one model. Silicified wood became petrified forest under another. Igneous uprights became plugs and necks under a third. Each label may be locally correct. The question is whether the categories were ever tested against one another at the largest scales. Could a world that preserves tree rings in stone also preserve giant trunk forms now filed under geology? Most researchers would say no, but no is not a sample. It is a threshold judgment, and threshold judgments are exactly where old mistakes can live the longest. Eyewitness description has a limited role in science, but it has a powerful role in perception, and perception is where investigation begins. Again and again, travellers, settlers, artists, and surveyors reach for the same vocabulary when confronted with these masses. Trunk, tower, stump, column, pipe, post, stem, crown. They were not making laboratory claims, they were reporting what the thing most resembled. Later viewers, trained by diagrams and signage, learned to see cooling fractures and erosional caps. Both perceptions are real, but only one is institutionally authorized. The other is treated as naive metaphor. That may be reasonable, or it may hide an older accuracy inside newer sophistication. Human beings are not reliable chemists by eye, but they are often reliable at noticing form. If 10,000 observers independently reach for the anatomy of a tree when looking at a formation, that does not establish truth. It does establish a problem the official explanation has not psychologically displaced. The image persists because the object keeps generating it. Even the language of erosion deserves more scrutiny than it usually receives. Erosion explains almost anything if given enough time, but explanation by vast duration can become too flexible to falsify. A tower stands alone because everything around it eroded. A crown is flat because caprock remained. Grooves formed because fractures guided weathering. The base flared because softer layers retreated. The debris gathered because gravity acted. All of that may be correct, but each sentence depends on a chain of assumptions about original conditions that are no longer present. Erosion is often inferred from what survives, then used to justify why so little survives. That is not illegitimate, it is often unavoidable. But it means the official account is sometimes reconstructive rather than demonstrative. The stump theory, for all its problems, exposes this weakness by asking a rude question. Are we explaining the object or explaining away its resemblance? That question matters because interpretation tends to become most rigid exactly where direct evidence grows thin. Consider scale one more time. The objection most often raised against the stump theory is that no tree of such magnitude belongs in accepted biology. That is true within accepted biology. But accepted biology is built from preserved samples, and preserved samples are themselves selective fragments. The fossil record is not a complete library. It is a salvage field. Environments erase more than they keep. Compression distorts, heat alters, chemistry replaces, deep time rearranges. We already know that ancient life included sizes, growth strategies, and atmospheric conditions that would have seemed impossible before they were found. Giant fungi were once absurd. Giant dragonflies were once absurd. Forests, unlike any modern biome, were once absurd. Absurdity is not evidence, but it is also not refutation. What matters is whether an object has been tested against the hypothesis it appears to invite. And in many of these formations, the tests most likely to settle that question are either not done, not designed for it, or not interpreted through that lens. This is where the theory becomes less about spectacle and more about method. If a formation were truly the mineralized remnant of a colossal biological structure, what would one expect to find? Internal organization inconsistent with ordinary igneous grain, repeated radial or concentric patterning beyond fracture mechanics, transitional zones resembling tissue replacement rather than simple cooling boundaries, associated deposits that make more sense as degraded organic surroundings than as random sediment. Perhaps not in every case, perhaps not clearly, but enough to trigger a serious program of comparison between known petrified wood and selected anomalous towers, mesas, and monoliths. The notable fact is not that such a program has disproved the theory. The notable fact is how little it seems to have been framed as a live question at all. The theory is usually dismissed at the level of ridicule, not resolved at the level of method. And ridicule is not data. It is a social shortcut taken when categories feel secure. By this point, the issue is no longer whether every mountain is a tree. That is not a serious claim. The issue is whether some of the most visually anomalous formations on Earth may have been over-assimilated into geological categories because those categories were institutionally available, while the biological alternative was culturally impossible. That would not require forged records. It would not require a secret committee. It would require something far more ordinary, experts trained inside a framework, funding tied to established disciplines, and a landscape so old and so stripped that only silhouettes remain. In that world, the wrong explanation can become stable for generations simply because it is good enough to administer, good enough to teach, good enough to print, good enough to protect, not good enough to settle. The record is still there, but the questions asked of it have narrowed. And that is the most unsettling possibility of all. Not that the land is lying, but that it has been patiently misdescribed. Not that anyone erased the evidence, but that the evidence was sorted into the wrong drawers. Not that the objects are impossible, but that their possibility was excluded before the investigation began. There is a difference between an answer and a vocabulary that prevents a different answer from forming. These formations may be exactly what the textbooks say they are. Many probably are, but some carry a residue of mismatch that the official language never quite removes. The stump image survives because the shape survives. The shape survives because the stone survives. The stone remembers. What changed was the explanation. So when a solitary tower rises from a plain with a cut top, a flared base, long vertical ridges, and a collar of collapse around it, the question is not whether it can be forced into a geological category. Almost anything can. The question is whether that category has earned its permanence in every case where it has been applied. Once that question is allowed, the entire landscape becomes less settled. Mesas become crowns, monoliths become trunks, debris fields become rings of failure, plateaus become remnants, not proof, not certainty, a reframing. And once seen, the reframing does not easily recede, the pattern does not disappear, it only waits behind the label. Maybe these structures are only stone arranged by heat, pressure, and time into forms that mimic life with eerie precision. Maybe some of them are something more literal, more ancient, and more biologically immense than modern categories allow. Either way, the burden is no longer on resemblance alone. It is on the methods used to dismiss resemblance without fully investigating it. The official explanation may be right, the hidden theory may be wrong, but if the objects continue to present the same contradiction in shape, scale, and context, then dismissal is not enough. The real question is not whether the theory sounds strange, but whether anyone with the tools to verify it has seriously looked.